mockingly invited to a fancy gathering. A black maid captivates the room with her radiant beauty, leaving her employer dumbfounded and transforming how she's viewed by all in attendance. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Harrison mansion as Helen paced across the marble floors, her designer heels clicking with each step. She stopped to adjust a flower arrangement, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she repositioned a white rose. The florists watched nervously, their expressions tense as they anticipated another correction. "No, no, this won't do," Helen muttered, gesturing at the centerpiece. "The roses need to be precisely 3 inches higher. Senator Williams's wife is known for her garden parties, and I won't have her thinking we're amateurs." She turned to the head decorator, who was clutching his tablet like a shield. "And the lighting, it's too harsh. We need it softer, more flattering." These people didn't spend thousands on cosmetic procedures to look washed out under spotlights. The decorator nodded quickly, making notes while speaking into his headset. Around them, a dozen workers scurried about, hanging crystal decorations and arranging furniture. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and cleaning products, mixing with the underlying tension of Helen's growing anxiety. She checked her phone again, 3 hours until the guests would arrive. This wasn't just any party. It was her chance to cement her position in the upper echelons of society. The guest list included 2 senators, a famous director, and several CEOs. Everything had to be perfect. "Jasmine," Helen's voice echoed through the foyer. "Jasmine, where are you?" The sound of quick footsteps preceded the appearance of Jasmine, her uniform pristine despite hours of helping with preparations. She stood straight, her expression neutral but dignified. "Yes, Mrs. Harrison?" Helen's eyes narrowed as she assessed her maid. Jasmine was too pretty, too poised for her liking, but she was efficient, and more importantly, she looked the part Helen wanted to present to her guests. The perfect example of her philanthropic nature, employing someone from a less fortunate background. The guest bathrooms need fresh hand towels, and make sure the soap dispensers are full. Also, Helen paused, a calculating look crossing her face. "I want you to attend the party tonight." Surprise flickered across Jasmine's features before she could suppress it. "Attend, Mrs. Harrison?" "Yes, yes," Helen waved her hand dismissively. "Several of my guests are on charitable boards. Having you there will show them how progressive we are. You can help serve drinks, of course, but mingle a bit too. Show them how well we treat our staff." The condescension in her voice was barely veiled. Jasmine's eyes hardened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Of course, Mrs. Harrison. What should I wear?" "Oh, anything appropriate you have in your closet. Nothing too attention-grabbing." Helen turned away, already focused on directing a worker who was hanging curtains. Back in her small room in the servants' wing, Jasmine stood before her closet, her hands clenched at her sides. The invitation wasn't kindness. It was a power play, another way for Helen to display her supposed generosity while keeping Jasmine in her place. But as she pushed aside her everyday clothes, her fingers brushed against something smooth and red. The dress had been waiting for the right moment. Jasmine had saved for months to buy it, attracted by its simple elegance and perfect tailoring. She pulled it out, holding it against herself in the mirror. The red silk caught the light, flowing like liquid fire. It wasn't flashy or overdone, but it was impossible to ignore, exactly like Jasmine herself. She slipped it on, the fabric embracing her curves. Without being inappropriate, the hem fell just below her knees, and the neckline was modest but flattering. She studied her reflection, touching the small scar on her collarbone, a reminder of her past, of everything she'd overcome. Helen wanted to present her as a charity case, a prop in her social performance. Instead, Jasmine would show them who she really was, dignified, intelligent, and absolutely unapologetic. She pinned her hair up, applied minimal makeup, and slipped on her best pair of black heels. The dress wasn't a costume or an act of rebellion. It was armor, a declaration of self-worth in a world that too often tried to define her by her job title or the color of her skin. Tonight, she wouldn't be playing the role Helen had written for her. She would be herself, and that would be more than enough to shake the foundations of Helen's carefully constructed world. The first guests arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, their luxury vehicles forming a gleaming parade in the circular driveway. Helen positioned herself strategically by the grand entrance, her silver designer gown catching the light as she greeted each arrival with practiced warmth. Her eyes darted constantly between guests, mentally checking names against her carefully curated list. "Senator Williams, how lovely to see you." She air-kissed the older man's wife while cataloging the woman's jewelry. Definitely new money, trying too hard with those oversized diamonds. "The education bill must be keeping you terribly busy." Behind her perfectly composed smile, Helen monitored everything. She noted which guests gravitated toward the champagne and which headed straight for the stronger drinks. She watched the catering staff's movements, correcting their positioning with subtle hand signals. Everything was orchestrated, from the volume of the string quartet to the precise temperature of the room. "Richard," she called out sharply, spotting her husband deep in conversation with the city's premier real estate developer. "Darling, come greet the Andersons." Richard Harrison excused himself and made his way over, his expensive suit and carefully maintained physique marking him as every inch the successful businessman. He played his role perfectly, though Helen noticed his third drink of the evening already in his hand. She'd have to watch that. The steady flow of arrivals had just begun to slow when the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a few heads turning, conversations pausing mid-sentence. Then the effect rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Jasmine stood at the top of the grand staircase, one hand resting lightly on the banister. The red dress caught the light perfectly, making her dark skin glow. She kept her jewelry minimal, small pearl earrings and a delicate gold chain, which only emphasized her natural elegance. Her posture was perfect, assured without being challenging. Helen's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. This wasn't the docile maid in a modest dress she'd expected. This was something else entirely. Richard's reaction was more obvious. He turned fully toward the stairs, his drink forgotten in his hand. His eyes followed Jasmine's descent, tracking each graceful step. Helen noticed her fingers tightening around her glass stem. Well, a dry voice commented from nearby. "This is unexpected." Tom Preston, Richard's oldest friend and the most cynical man in their social circle, stood watching the scene with obvious amusement. His steel-gray hair and sharp features gave him a predatory look, enhanced by his habit of delivering cutting remarks with a smile. "Surely, that's not your—" He paused deliberately. "Domestic staff, Helen?" Before Helen could respond, Jasmine reached the bottom of the stairs and moved seamlessly into the crowd. She carried herself with quiet confidence, nodding politely to guests who stared openly at her. Several women immediately began whispering behind their hands. "I wasn't aware the help was joining us this evening," Tom continued, his voice carrying just far enough to make Helen wince. "Though I suppose it's very progressive of you." He moved through the crowd toward Jasmine, clearly intending to put her in her place with his trademark sarcasm. Helen watched, anticipating the satisfaction of seeing Jasmine humbled. Instead, she witnessed something unexpected. As Tom approached with a condescending smile, Jasmine turned to face him directly. Their conversation was too distant to overhear, but Helen could see Tom's expression shift from dismissive to surprised, then genuinely engaged. Jasmine was speaking animatedly about something, her hands moving gracefully to emphasize her points. Tom's usual smirk had transformed into an expression of genuine interest. He asked a question, leaned in to hear her response, then actually laughed, not his usual sardonic chuckle, but a real laugh. Richard had drifted closer to their conversation, ostensibly getting another drink from a nearby server. His eyes kept returning to Jasmine, drawn by more than just her physical beauty. There was something magnetic about her presence, the way she held herself, the quiet authority in her expression. Helen watched as more guests began to gravitate toward Jasmine's corner of the room. The carefully planned social dynamics of her party were shifting, reorganizing themselves around an unexpected center. The woman she'd intended to be a prop, a symbol of her own magnanimity, was instead becoming the star of the evening. She needed to regain control of the situation. But as she watched Tom, cynical, unimpressible Tom, fully engaged in conversation with her maid, Helen felt the first real stirring of uncertainty. Something was happening here that she hadn't planned for, hadn't even considered possible. The party was just beginning, and already the careful facade she'd constructed was showing cracks. The party had moved into its second hour when Tom and Jasmine found themselves in a quieter corner of the room, their conversation having evolved far beyond the superficial small talk typical of such gatherings. The string quartet's music provided a gentle backdrop as they stood near a window overlooking the illuminated garden. "So, you're telling me you actually design clothes?" Tom's skepticism had been replaced by genuine curiosity. He gestured to her red dress. "Did you make this?" "No, but I could have." Jasmine's voice carried no defensiveness, just quiet confidence. "I have sketches, portfolios. I study design through online courses while working. Fashion isn't just about wearing expensive labels. It's about understanding how fabric moves, how colors work together, how a single seam can change everything." Tom swirled his scotch thoughtfully. "And yet you're here serving drinks instead of showing at Fashion Week. Because life isn't that simple, Mr. Preston. Opportunities don't magically appear because you have talent. Some doors remain closed unless someone with power decides to open them." She met his gaze steadily. "But that doesn't mean I've given up." "Tom," he corrected, studying her with new eyes. "Call me Tom. And you're right. I apologize for my earlier assumptions. They were predictable." Jasmine finished for him. "But assumptions can be changed. That's why I'm here tonight, wearing this dress, having this conversation with you." Across the room, Helen was becoming increasingly agitated. She'd spent the last 20 minutes trying to direct attention toward her new art collection, but her carefully prepared talking points about each piece fell flat as guests kept glancing toward Jasmine's corner of the room. "Can you believe this?" Helen hissed to Carla, her closest friend and usually reliable ally in social warfare. "She's completely hijacking my event. And look at Richard. He hasn't taken his eyes off her all evening." Carla, a tall woman who spent more on maintaining her appearance than most people spend on their cars, narrowed her eyes at Jasmine. "That dress is completely inappropriate for household staff. It's obviously designer. How could she possibly afford it?" "It's not designer," Helen snapped. "I know every label worth knowing. That dress is its—" She faltered, unable to place the style. It was undeniably elegant, the kind of simple sophistication that actually made the more elaborately dressed guests look overdone in comparison. Carla straightened her own heavily beaded gown self-consciously. "Well, someone needs to put her in her place. This is absurd." She started toward Jasmine with determination, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Conversations quieted as Carla approached Jasmine and Tom. Everyone knew Carla's reputation for cutting remarks delivered with a sweet smile. They anticipated entertainment. "That's quite a dress for someone of your position," Carla said loudly enough to draw attention. "One might almost think you were trying to be something you're not." The room held its breath. Tom started to speak, but Jasmine placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Thank you for noticing the dress, Mrs. Davidson," Jasmine replied, her voice carrying clearly but without aggression. "You know, I've always admired how you recognize quality. That Valentino you wore to the charity gala last month? Stunning. The way it complemented your natural elegance. That's exactly what fashion should do. It should enhance, not overshadow." Carla blinked, caught off guard by the genuine warmth in Jasmine's voice and the unexpected compliment. "You notice my Valentino?" "Of course." The craftsmanship was exceptional. The beading alone must have taken weeks of handwork. Jasmine stepped closer, speaking more quietly now. "Though if you don't mind me saying, you don't need such elaborate designs. Your bone structure would be showcased beautifully by simpler lines." Several nearby women nodded unconsciously, drawn into the conversation. Carla touched her heavily styled hair uncertainly. "You really think so?" The hostility had drained from her voice, replaced by genuine interest. "Absolutely. Fashion should serve the woman, not the other way around." Jasmine smiled warmly. "Would you like to hear my thoughts about this season's trends? I have some ideas that would work wonderfully with your coloring." Within minutes, Carla had forgotten her original mission. She was deep in conversation with Jasmine, other women gathering around them to listen and contribute. The discussion moved from fashion to art, then to travel, Jasmine demonstrating knowledge that clearly wasn't gained from magazines or television. Helen watched in growing frustration as her best friend was won over. The party had developed a natural center, and it wasn't around her expensive art or carefully chosen wine. Even the senator's wife had drifted over to join Jasmine's group. Richard continued to hover at the edges of these conversations, his expression thoughtful. He'd barely spoken to Helen all evening, and now she saw him signaling for another drink. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. She needed to regain control. But as she watched Jasmine effortlessly navigate the social currents of the room, Helen felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine fear. Not of physical harm, but of something perhaps more threatening to her world: irrelevance. The encounter in the upstairs bathroom wasn't planned. Carla had excused herself from the party, needing a moment to reapply her lipstick and gather her thoughts. She didn't expect to find Jasmine there, adjusting a towel that had fallen askew. The space suddenly felt too small, too intimate for their usual social masks. In the unforgiving bathroom lighting, Carla caught her own reflection, the carefully constructed facade of perfection showing tiny cracks. Her designer dress, which had cost more than some cars, suddenly felt heavy and restrictive. "I can leave if you'd pee. Prefer privacy," Jasmine offered quietly, moving toward the door. "Why are you doing this?" Carla's question burst out before she could stop herself. "Why come here tonight, dressed like that, talking like one of us?" Jasmine turned back, studying Carla's face. Not her makeup or her jewelry or her carefully styled hair, but her actual face, the slight tremor in her lip, the uncertainty in her eyes. "Like one of you?" Jasmine's voice was gentle. "Mrs. Davidson, do you know why I chose this dress?" Carla's hand went self-consciously to her own beaded gown. "To show off? To make us look overdressed and silly?" "No." Jasmine stepped closer to the mirror, standing beside Carla. "I chose it because it's true to who I am. Not who others expect me to be, not who society says I should be, but who I actually am." She gestured to Carla's reflection. "When was the last time you chose something just because it felt right to you, not because it was expected?" The question hit Carla like a physical blow. She stared at their reflections side by side, her own elaborate ensemble and Jasmine's elegant simplicity. Carla's voice cracked slightly. "I can't remember. Everything I wear, everything I do, it's all about maintaining the image. Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't recognize myself anymore." "Take off your necklace," Jasmine suggested quietly. "What?" "Just try it. That heavy diamond piece. It's beautiful, but it's wearing you, not the other way around." With trembling fingers, Carla unclasped the expensive necklace. As it came off, she straightened unconsciously, her neck elongating naturally without the weight. "Now look," Jasmine said. "Look at your neck, your collarbones. You have naturally elegant features. You don't need all that extra adornment to be beautiful." Carla stared at her reflection, really seeing herself perhaps for the first time in years. A tear slipped down her cheek, threatening to ruin her careful makeup. "Here." Jasmine handed her a tissue. "And you know what? Your smile is prettier without the heavy lipstick." Meanwhile, downstairs, Helen was reaching her breaking point. She'd watched Richard circling the party, his eyes constantly drawn to Jasmine, like a compass finding north. Now he stood near the French doors, on his fifth drink of the evening, barely pretending to listen to a conversation about golf. "Richard," she hissed, finally cornering him. "A word. Now!" She practically dragged him into his study, closing the door on the party sounds. The room, with its leather chairs and carefully curated displays of success, had always been their safe space for handling crises. "What do you think you're doing?" Helen's voice was low but intense. "Everyone has noticed how you're looking at her." Richard took another sip of his drink, not meeting her eyes. "Looking at who, Helen? Our maid? The one you invited to this party as a prop for your social theater? Don't you dare turn this around on me. I saw you watching her come down those stairs. You've barely taken your eyes off her all night." Maybe because she's the only real thing in this entire house. Richard's voice rose suddenly. Have you looked around lately, Helen? Really looked? Everything here is for show. The art you don't understand, the books you've never read, the people you call friends but actually despise. Keep your voice down, Helen warned, glancing at the door. You're drunk. No, I'm finally seeing clearly. Do you know what Jasmine and Tom were discussing earlier? Art. Real art, not just the names and prices you memorize for your dinner party conversations. She knows things, Helen. She thinks things. She's the help. Helen's control snapped. She's nothing. A servant playing dress-up. And you're making a fool of yourself over her. The only fool here is the woman who thinks designer labels and social connections can hide an empty soul. Richard's words landed like slaps. Jasmine has more genuine elegance in her little finger than you've achieved with all your plastic surgery and social climbing. Helen stepped back as if he'd physically struck her. In 20 years of marriage, Richard had never spoken to her like this. He played along with her social ambitions, funded her endless self-improvement projects, supported her networking schemes. Now she saw something in his eyes she'd never expected: disappointment. The party sounds filtered through the closed door. Laughter, music, the buzz of conversation. Helen's perfectly orchestrated evening was unraveling, and with it, possibly her marriage. All because of a maid in a red dress who refused to stay in her assigned place. This isn't over, Helen said, her voice shaking slightly. I won't let her ruin everything I've built. That's the problem, Helen. Richard set down his empty glass. You didn't build anything real. You just arranged pretty facades. And now someone genuine has walked into our lives, and you can't stand it because it shows everyone exactly what you're not. He walked out of the study, leaving Helen alone with her fury and her fear. The party continued beyond the door, but now it felt like a tide pulling away from her, leaving her stranded and exposed. Richard stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the garden lights flicker across the manicured lawn. His confrontation with Helen had left him shaken, but also strangely liberated. For the first time in years, he'd spoken truth instead of social niceties. From his position, he could see Jasmine engaged in conversation with a small group of guests. She was describing something, her hands moving expressively, and he noticed how her audience leaned in to catch every word. There was no artifice in her gestures, no calculated performance, just genuine passion for whatever she was discussing. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of passion? His own life had become a series of business meetings, charity galas, and silent dinners with Helen, each of them retreating further behind their phones and social obligations. He'd built an empire of real estate developments, but standing here now, he couldn't remember why any of it mattered. She's quite something, isn't she? Tom appeared beside him, holding 2 fresh drinks. He handed one to Richard. Not at all what one expects. Richard accepted the drink automatically. What do you mean? Oh, come on, Richard. I've known you for 20 years. I recognize that look. You're seeing possibilities you never knew existed. Tom's voice held no judgment, just observation. She was just telling me about her design work. Did you know she's created an entire collection? Modern professional wear for working women, emphasizing comfort and dignity. Quite brilliant, actually. I didn't know, Richard said quietly. There's so much we didn't know. Across the room, Helen was attempting to salvage her evening. She'd emerged from the study with renewed determination, inserting herself into conversations with forced cheerfulness. But her usual social magic wasn't working. Every group she joined seemed to naturally drift toward where Jasmine was holding court. You simply must tell everyone about your recent trip to Paris. Helen practically commanded one of her regular social allies, desperate to redirect attention. The shopping was divine, wasn't it? Actually, the woman replied, glancing toward Jasmine. We were just discussing the evolution of French fashion houses and their influence on modern design. Your maid has the most fascinating insights into the industry's transformation. Did you know she studied enough? Helen's voice cut through the conversation like a knife. Several nearby guests turned to stare. Enough about my maid. This is ridiculous. All of you, fawning over her like she's some kind of what, Helen? Richard's voice came from behind her. He'd moved away from the window, drawn by her outburst. An intelligent, accomplished woman. Someone with actual knowledge and passion instead of memorized social scripts. The room had gone quiet. Even the string quartet seemed to be playing more softly. Helen turned to face her husband, her carefully made-up face flushed with anger and humiliation. "How dare you?" she hissed. "In front of everyone? You're taking her side?" "This isn't about sides," Richard replied, his voice steady. "This is about truth. Something this house hasn't seen in a very long time." Jasmine stood perfectly still, her red dress a splash of color in the suddenly tense atmosphere. She hadn't moved or spoken, but her presence seemed to fill the room. The other guests watched the scene unfold with a mixture of discomfort and fascination. "Truth." Helen's laugh was brittle. "You want truth? The truth is that she's nothing but a servant who's forgotten her place. And you," she jabbed a finger at Richard's chest, "you're making a fool of yourself mooning over her like some lovesick teenager." "Helen!" Richard caught her wrist gently but firmly. "The only fool here is someone who judges people by their job title instead of their character." "Character?" Helen wrenched her hand away. "What do you know about her character? She comes into my house, wearing that dress, turning my friends against me." "Your friends?" Richard's voice rose slightly. "These people aren't your friends, Helen. They're your audience. And for once, they're seeing something genuine instead of another performance." The guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one left. They couldn't. The scene playing out before them was too raw, too real to ignore. It was like watching a perfect porcelain mask crack, revealing something dark and desperate underneath. "I built this life," Helen's voice shook. "I created all of this. Everything you see, the connections, the influence, the respect, you bought it," Richard cut in, "with my money and your pretense. But you can't buy what she is naturally. That's what's really bothering you, isn't it?" Jasmine finally stepped forward, her movement drawing all eyes. "Mrs. Harrison, I never meant to—" "Don't!" Helen spun toward her. "Don't you dare pretend this wasn't your plan all along. Coming here dressed like that, showing off your knowledge, charming everyone. You're trying to destroy everything I've built." "The only person destroying anything here is you, Helen," Richard said quietly. "And you're doing a remarkable job of it without any help." The party had become a tableau of frozen figures, all watching the destruction of a carefully constructed social facade. The only sound was Helen's rapid breathing and the distant ticking of the grand clock in the hall. The elegant party had devolved into something far more primal, a social battlefield where decades of unspoken rules and assumptions were suddenly up for debate. The guests had unconsciously divided themselves into camps, some clustered near Helen, maintaining their allegiance to the old order, while others drifted toward Jasmine, drawn by the authenticity she represented. "I've known Helen for 15 years, one woman whispered loudly to her group. "She's always been so generous with her advice about how we should dress, who we should know." "You mean controlling," another guest cut in, her voice carrying clearly. "Let's be honest for once. We've all spent years trying to meet her standards, feeling somehow less because we didn't quite measure up." The murmurs grew louder, years of suppressed resentments finally finding voice. A prominent socialite stepped forward, glass in hand. "Last year, Helen told me my daughter's wedding wasn't suitable for her calendar because the venue wasn't prestigious enough." She turned to Helen. "My only daughter's wedding, and you made me feel ashamed of it." More voices joined in, the dam of polite silence finally breaking. "Remember when she said my charity foundation was quaint? She told me my interior decorator must be colorblind. My husband, ND's business wasn't established enough for her dinner parties." Helen's face had gone pale, but she rallied, drawing herself up. "I was helping you, all of you, teaching you how to be better, how to succeed in this world. Better according to whom?" The question came from Carla, who had returned from the bathroom, transformed. She'd removed her heavy necklace, wiped away some of her makeup, and looked somehow younger, more genuine. "I've spent 2 decades trying to live up to your impossible standards, Helen. Do you know what it's cost me?" The room crackled with tension. Richard watched the scene unfold, his expression a mixture of sadness and revelation. Tom stood nearby, his usual cynical smile replaced by thoughtful observation. Jasmine moved then, stepping into the center of the room. Her red dress caught the light, but it was her presence, not her clothing, that commanded attention. She didn't raise her voice, but somehow it carried to every corner. "I didn't come here tonight to create conflict," she began. "I came because, despite everything, I believe that underneath all our social masks, we're capable of seeing each other as human beings." She looked around the room, meeting eyes directly, not as titles or bank accounts or addresses, but as people with dreams, fears, and the capacity for growth. She turned to Helen, who seemed frozen in place. "Mrs. Harrison, you invited me tonight as a symbol of your generosity, to show these people how magnanimous you could be to someone you considered beneath you. But that's not who I am. That's not who any of us really is." "You have no right," Helen began, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "We all have the right to be ourselves," Jasmine continued. "The real tragedy isn't that I dared to show my true self tonight. It's that so many of us have spent years hiding who we really are, trying to fit into boxes that were never meant to contain us." The room was absolutely still now. Even those who had been loyal to Helen were listening, really listening, perhaps for the first time. "Look around this room." Jasmine gestured to the gathering. "Every person here has a story, talents, dreams that go beyond their social status or bank balance. Mrs. Davidson," she nodded to Carla, "has an eye for beauty that's been buried under others' expectations. Mr. Preston," she smiled at Tom, "hides his genuine curiosity behind cynicism because it's safer than showing he cares." She turned to Richard. "And some of us have built empires while forgetting to build lives worth living." Finally, she faced Helen again. "You're not my enemy, Mrs. Harrison. The real enemy is the fear that makes us believe we're only worth what others see in us. The fear that makes us create elaborate facades instead of genuine connections." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Several guests were wiping away tears. Others stood straighter, as if physically shedding years of social pressure. "I don't need your pity," Helen spat, but her voice wavered. "No," Jasmine agreed softly. "What you need, what we all need, is the courage to be authentic, to stop performing and start living." The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't the awkward silence of social embarrassment, but something deeper, the quiet of a collective revelation, of masks beginning to crack and fall away. In the wake of Jasmine's speech, the party fragmented into small, intense clusters of conversation. The usual social barriers had dissolved, replaced by something raw and genuine. In one corner, a renowned surgeon was confessing his secret passion for painting watercolors. Near the fireplace, a judge's wife spoke quietly about her dreams of opening a bookstore. "I haven't written a poem since college," admitted a powerful CEO to his small group, his voice thick with emotion. "I used to love it, but somewhere along the way, I decided it wasn't appropriate for someone in my position." "Why?" asked another guest. "Who made that RUL?" "Eh?" "We did," someone else answered softly. "All of us. We've been policing each other's dreams for so long, we forgot we had the power to stop." The conversations rippled through the room. Years of suppressed authenticity finally finding voice. People who had spent decades competing for social status were suddenly sharing vulnerabilities, admitting to simple pleasures and unfulfilled dreams. Richard stood apart from these groups, watching the transformation with a mixture of wonder and regret. His carefully constructed world of business deals and social obligations felt suddenly hollow. He made his way toward Jasmine, who was speaking quietly with an elderly woman about her volunteer work at a local shelter. "Excuse me," he said, waiting for a break in their conversation. "May I have a moment?" Jasmine nodded, following him to a quieter spot near the garden doors. The night air carried the scent of Helen's prized roses, but Richard barely noticed. "I've spent 30 years building something I thought was important," he began, his voice low and intense. "Real estate developments, office towers, luxury apartments, concrete and steel monuments to success. But standing here tonight, I can't remember the last time I built something that actually mattered." Jasmine listened quietly, her presence encouraging without demanding. "When I was younger," he continued, I wanted to design sustainable housing. Affordable homes that wouldn't strip people of their dignity. Somewhere along the way, I traded that dream for profit margins and prestigious addresses. It's not too late, Jasmine said gently. Dreams don't expire unless we let them. How you do it? Richard asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. How do you maintain such clarity about who you are, what you want, when the whole world seems designed to make us compromise? Because I learned early that the cost of losing yourself is far greater than the price of standing your ground, she replied. Every time we deny our true nature, we die a little inside. I decided I'd rather face external resistance than internal decay. Across the room, Helen stood alone, watching her carefully curated social world transform into something unrecognizable. The sight of Richard and Jasmine deep in conversation sent waves of conflicting emotions through her: anger, fear, and underneath it all, a crushing sense of loss. She observed as Carla, her oldest friend, laughed genuinely for the first time in years, her face younger without its usual mask of heavy makeup. Tom, usually so quick with cutting remarks, was earnestly discussing philosophy with a young artist he would have dismissed hours earlier. The perfect society hostess facade Helen had spent decades constructing was crumbling, and with it, her sense of identity. Who was she without her carefully maintained image? What remained when the designer clothes, social connections, and power plays were stripped away? She caught her reflection in a window, immaculate makeup, expensive jewelry, professional smile frozen in place. But her eyes held something new: fear. Not just of losing her social position or even her husband's attention, but something deeper. The fear of being seen, truly seen, without all her carefully constructed armor. A younger woman approached her, hesitantly. Mrs. Harrison? I've always wanted to tell you, I used to admire how confidently you carried yourself. But watching you tonight, I realize confidence isn't the same as armor. And maybe all of us have been hiding behind our own versions of armor for too long. Helen couldn't respond. The words stuck in her throat, years of practiced social responses suddenly inadequate. She watched as the young woman walked away, joining a group where genuine laughter and conversation flowed freely. The party continued around her, but Helen had never felt more alone. The carefully orchestrated evening had transformed into something organic and real, leaving her stranded on an island of her own making. Her eyes kept returning to Jasmine and Richard, still deep in conversation. There was an ease between them that she and Richard had never achieved in 20 years of marriage. The ticking of the grand clock seemed to mock her, marking the moments as her world shifted on its axis. Everything she had built, every relationship she had carefully cultivated, was being reevaluated in the harsh light of authenticity that Jasmine had somehow switched on. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the mansion had fundamentally shifted. The usual careful dance of social positioning had been replaced by something more genuine. Groups formed and reformed organically, conversations flowing with unprecedented honesty. Even the staff, usually invisible at such gatherings, found themselves drawn into discussions. The barriers of class and status that had seemed so solid at the beginning of the evening had become remarkably permeable. A Supreme Court justice was earnestly discussing education reform with a kindergarten teacher. The owner of a major league sports team sat cross-legged on the floor, his expensive suit forgotten as he showed pictures of the rescue dogs he secretly fostered, a passion he'd never dared mention in these circles before. Tom found himself gravitating back toward Jasmine, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. He'd spent decades perfecting his role as the cynical observer, the sharp-tongued critic whose witty barbs were both feared and sought after. But tonight, that familiar armor felt heavy and unnecessary. You know, he said, joining her by the grand piano, I've spent 20 years in these rooms watching people play their parts. I thought I had everyone figured out. Jasmine turned to him, her attention focused, but not demanding. And now I realize I've been playing a part too. The cynical intellectual, too sophisticated to be moved by anything. He laughed softly, but there was no bite to it. Do you know what I really love? Comic books, superhero stories, All that wonderfully unsophisticated hope and courage and believing in something bigger than yourself. Why is that embarrassing? Jasmine asked. Stories about standing up for what's right, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. Those seem pretty sophisticated to me. Tom was quiet for a moment, considering. I used to write stories back in college. Aventure tales fantasy. Then I got a real job in finance, and somewhere along the way, I decided that cynicism was safer than vulnerability. If you mock everything, nothing can hurt you. But nothing can touch you either, Jasmine observed quietly. Exactly. Tom's usual sharp features had softened. I've spent so long being the clever critic, I forgot how to be the person who believes in possibilities. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of another guest, but something had shifted between them. Tom felt decades of calculated distance beginning to crumble. As the evening wore on, more people found their way to Jasmine, drawn by her ability to see past their social facades to their authentic selves. But it wasn't just her insight that attracted them. It was the permission she seemed to grant, simply by being herself, for others to do the same. I never wanted to be a lawyer, confessed a prominent attorney. I wanted to teach history, but in my family, that wasn't an option. My gallery shows whatever's trendy, admitted an art dealer. But what I really love is traditional landscape painting. Simple, honest captures of natural beauty. Each confession seemed to inspire others, creating a cascade of authenticity that transformed the party from a social obligation into something approaching a collective catharsis. Tom watched this transformation with growing wonder. His writer's eye caught the details. The way people's postures relaxed as they shed their social armor, how genuine laughter replaced polite chuckles, the spontaneous formations of connections based on shared passions rather than shared social status. You've created quite a revolution here, he said to Jasmine during a quiet moment. I didn't create anything, she replied. I just refused to play a role that wasn't mine. Everything else came from people's hunger for authenticity. But why now? Why this party? Surely you've been to other events here. Jasmine's expression grew thoughtful. Sometimes the right moment finds you, rather than the other way around. Tonight, something was ready to crack. All it needed was someone to show that it was possible to be genuine and survive. Tom studied her with new understanding. You're not just talking about tonight, are you? This is about something bigger. Everything is about something bigger, Tom. The roles we play, the masks we wear, they're all symptoms of a deeper fear. The fear that who we really are isn't enough. Their conversation deepened, moving beyond the superficial to explore the nature of authenticity itself. Tom found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. His secret dreams, his buried regrets, his fear that he'd spent so long playing a role that he'd forgotten who he really was. And as they talked, something unexpected happened. The cynical armor Tom had worn for so long continued to crack and fall away, revealing not the vulnerability he'd feared, but a strength he'd forgotten he possessed. Helen stood in her powder room, hands gripping the marble countertop as she stared at her reflection. The perfect makeup couldn't hide the growing desperation in her eyes. The sounds of genuine laughter and earnest conversation filtered through the door. Her party had become a revolution she couldn't control. Enough, she whispered to her reflection. 20 years of social engineering wouldn't be undone by one maid in a red dress. She had built this world, piece by careful piece, and she would not let it slip away. Straightening her spine, Helen checked her appearance one final time. Her arsenal of social weapons was still intact. The hints she could drop about private indiscretions, the business deals she could influence, the charity board position she controlled. It was time to remind everyone exactly who held the real power in this room. She emerged from the powder room with renewed purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a general preparing for battle. The scene that greeted her only fueled her determination. Her carefully segregated social circles had dissolved into organic groups, all pretense abandoned. Ladies and gentlemen, Helen's voice cut through the conversations, years of social authority lending a carrying power. I believe it's time we address the elephant in the room. The discussions quieted, faces turning toward her. She noticed some guests instinctively straightening their posture, old habits of deference dying hard. But others, Too many others watched her with new, evaluating eyes. We've all been very entertained by this evening's unusual turn of events, Helen continued, her smile sharp as a blade. It's been quite theatrical, hasn't it? Almost like a carefully planned performance. She moved to the center of the room, positioning herself strategically between Jasmine and the majority of the guests. But perhaps it's time for some truth, real truth, not this manufactured moment of supposed authenticity. Helen, Richard warned, stepping forward, but she waved him off. No, darling, let me finish. After all, isn't this evening all about honesty? Her laugh held no humor. Well, let's be honest about what's really happening here. About how a servant has manipulated her way into our circle, playing on our emotions, making us question things that don't need questioning. The room had gone completely still. Even the servers had frozen in place, trays suspended mid-motion. You all think you've experienced some kind of revelation tonight, Helen's voice dripped with contempt. Sharing your little secrets, your abandoned dreams, your regrets. As if any of that matters in the real world. The world I've helped all of you navigate successfully for years. She turned to face different groups as she spoke. Jeffrey, remember who smoothed things over during that unfortunate SSC investigation? Marion, that board position you coveted. Who made that happen? And Thomas, she fixed Tom with a pointed stare. Who kept your brother's scandal out of the papers? Each named person flinched slightly, but Helen wasn't finished. I've spent decades building and maintaining the social order that has benefited every person in this room. And you're all ready to throw it away because the help puts on a pretty dress and spouts some feel-good nonsense about being authentic? That's enough. The voice came from behind her, Carla's voice, but different somehow. Stronger. We're not throwing away anything, Helen. We're finally seeing it for what it really is, a prison we built ourselves, with you as the chief architect. Helen spun to face her oldest friend, shock momentarily cracking her composed facade. You of all people, yes me. Carla stepped forward, her simplified appearance lending her words more weight. For 20 years, I've let you dictate every aspect of my life. How I dress, who I talk to, what opinions I'm allowed to have. Do you know why? She didn't wait for an answer. Because you convinced me I needed you. That your approval was the key to everything. But looking at you now, I realize you're terrified. Because if we all stop playing by your rules, you have nothing left. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Helen felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, her careful web of influence unraveling strand by strand. You're all being ridiculous, she tried, but her voice had lost its authority. This isn't about me. This is about maintaining the standards that separate us from what, Mrs. Harrison? Jasmine's quiet voice somehow carried more power than Helen's ever had. From people like me? Or from the parts of ourselves we've been taught to despise? The room held its breath. Helen turned slowly to face her opponent, really seeing her for the first time. The red dress wasn't just beautiful. It was a declaration of selfhood, of refusing to be diminished. You don't belong here, Helen said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. None of us belong in the boxes you've created, Jasmine replied. That's what everyone in this room is finally realizing. Helen looked around desperately, seeking allies, but found only thoughtful faces looking back at her. Even those who had benefited most from her influence were watching her with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time the cost of their privileged cage. The tension in the room was electric when the front door opened, admitting an unexpected late arrival. Margaret Fairchild, once Helen's closest friend before mysteriously withdrawing from society 3 years ago, stood in the entrance. Her simple but elegant attire and natural gray hair marked a stark contrast to the elaborate styling of most guests. Helen's face went pale. Margaret? You weren't invited. No, Margaret agreed, moving into the room with quiet confidence. But my cousin was... She walked directly to Jasmine and embraced her, leaving the room in stunned silence. Cousin? Helen's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, Helen. Jasmine Fairchild Shin, head designer for Maison Laurent in Paris, and my beloved cousin. Margaret's voice carried clearly through the silent room. Though tonight she's been going by just Jasmine, her mother's name. The revelation rippled through the gathering. Jasmine Fairchild Chen was a rising star in the fashion world. Her designs celebrated for their combination of elegance and accessibility. Her recent collection had been featured in Vogue, though few had seen photos of the designer herself. "That's impossible," Helen stammered. "She's my maid. She works for me." "No, Helen," Jasmine spoke softly. "I worked as your housekeeper because I wanted to understand something. 3 years ago, Margaret told me about a woman who had systematically destroyed her position in society because she dared to start a foundation supporting underprivileged artists. That woman was her best friend." Margaret stepped forward. "You didn't think I just disappeared, did you, Helen? You orchestrated my social exile because I stopped playing by your rules. Because I chose to use my privilege to help others instead of maintaining the barriers you hold so dear." Understanding dawned on the faces around the room. Helen's influence hadn't just been about maintaining social order. It had been about actively suppressing anyone who challenged it. "When Margaret told me what happened," Jasmine continued, "I wanted to understand how someone could have that kind of power over others' lives. So I created this experiment. I took a job in your household, watching how you wielded influence, how you maintained control through fear and obligation." Tom let out a low whistle. "The perfect anthropological study. You placed yourself at the bottom of the social hierarchy to understand how it's maintained from the top." "Yes," Jasmine acknowledged. "But something unexpected happened. As I worked here, I saw how the system trapped everyone, not just those it was meant to exclude, but those it was meant to privilege. I saw talented, passionate people slowly suffocating under the weight of social expectations." Richard stepped forward. "All those conversations about design, about fashion history, you weren't just studying. You were testing to see who would engage with a servant as a human being. And you passed that test, Richard," Margaret said gently. "Many of you did. You showed that underneath all the social conditioning, there was still a capacity for genuine connection." Helen's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. "You infiltrated my home, spied on me, turned everyone against me." "No, Helen." Jasmine's voice was compassionate but firm. "You did that yourself. Every time you used someone's secrets against them, every time you punished authenticity with exclusion, every time you made someone feel small to make yourself feel powerful, you built this moment." The room was processing this revelation in waves. Some guests looked shocked, others thoughtful, and a few were actually smiling, as if pieces of a puzzle had finally clicked into place. "Your red dress," Carla said suddenly. "It's from your latest collection, isn't it? The one about breaking free from social constraints?" "Yes," Jasmine smiled. "It's called Liberation in Red. The entire collection is about the courage to be yourself in a world that demands conformity." Helen looked around wildly, seeing her carefully constructed world crumbling beyond repair. "You can't all be taking this seriously. Everything I did for us, to maintain our position, our privilege, our prison," Tom finished quietly. "Face it, Helen, the game is over. And thank God for that." The evening had become something none of the guests would ever forget. The night their gilded cage was finally opened. One by one, they approached Jasmine and Margaret, some offering apologies, others expressing gratitude, all somehow lighter for having witnessed the collapse of a system that had constrained them all. Richard was the last to approach. "What happens now?" he asked, looking at both his wife and the woman who had shaken their world. "Now," Jasmine said, "everyone gets to choose who they really want to be, including Helen." Helen stood alone in the center of her perfect room, surrounded by the ruins of her perfect life. But in that moment of complete destruction, something unexpected flickered in her eyes, the first glimmer of possibility, of freedom from the role she'd played for so long. The party was over, but something new was just beginning.